What if I told you that there once lived a man who was shot through the heart, but refused to die? Not because of some miracle of modern medicine, not because the bullet missed vital organs, but because his sheer force of will kept death itself at bay. This is the story of General Caspar von Eisenhardt, a forgotten commander from the brutal winter campaigns of 1823, who made a promise so sacred that even death had to wait. In the frozen wastelands of the Carpathian Mountains, where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero and wolves hunted in packs of hundreds, von Eisenhardt's regiment found themselves cut off from all supply lines, surrounded by enemy forces, and facing what seemed like certain annihilation. But what happened next defies everything we know about human biology, about death itself, and about the terrifying power of an unbreakable oath, shot directly through the heart by an enemy sniper. The general should have died instantly. Instead, he stood up, blood streaming from the gaping wound in his chest, and declared to his men that he would not fall until every last soldier under his command was safely home. For 3 days and 3 nights, with a hole where his heart should be beating, General von Eisenhardt continued to lead his men through the most horrific retreat in military history. This is not just a story of courage. This is a story of something far more disturbing, something that challenges our understanding of life and death itself. Because what kept the general alive during those 72 hours wasn't medical science or battlefield adrenaline. It was something much darker, much more ancient, and infinitely more terrifying. The year was 1823, and Europe was still bleeding from decades of endless war. The 7th Moravian Regiment, under the command of General Caspar von Eisenhardt, had been deployed to the remote Carpathian frontier, tasked with securing a strategic mountain pass that controlled trade routes between the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman territories. It was supposed to be a routine posting, a quiet assignment for battle-weary veterans. Von Eisenhardt was not like other military commanders, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with piercing grey eyes and scars covering every inch of visible skin. He was a man who had survived 17 major battles and countless smaller skirmishes. His men called him Der Eisengeist, the Iron Ghost, because no matter how desperate the situation, no matter how many fell around him, the general always emerged from the smoke and carnage, unbroken and unyielding. But there was something else about von Eisenhardt that his men whispered about in hushed tones around the campfires. Something that made even the most hardened veterans cross themselves when they spoke his name. The general had never been seen to sleep. Not once, in all their years of service under his command, had any soldier witnessed their commander lying down to rest. He would pace the perimeter of their camps all night long, his heavy boots crunching through snow and mud, his pale eyes scanning the darkness as if he could see things that others could not. The local mountain folk, when they encountered the regiment, would make strange gestures with their hands and mutter prayers in languages that predated Christianity by thousands of years. They called von Eisenhardt Nemura Toril, the Undying One, and claimed that he had made a bargain with forces that existed in the spaces between life and death. On the 15th of November, everything changed. Enemy forces, moving with unprecedented coordination and numbers, launched a surprise attack that cut the regiment off from all escape routes. Within hours, von Eisenhardt's 900 men found themselves trapped in a narrow valley, surrounded by over 3,000 enemy soldiers, who seemed to know their every move before they made it. The siege lasted for 6 days. Food ran out. Water froze solid in their canteens. Men began dying not from enemy bullets, but from the brutal cold that turned human breath into ice crystals and made exposed skin turn black with frostbite within minutes. The enemy commander General Kozlov sent message after message, demanding surrender, promising that he would execute only the officers and allow the common soldiers to return home. But von Eisenhardt refused every offer. He gathered his remaining men around him and spoke words that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. I swore an oath when I took command of this regiment. An oath not just to the empire, not just to military honor, but to something far older and more binding. Every man under my command will return home alive, or I will never know the peace of death. The men didn't understand the full meaning of his words then. They would learn, in the most terrifying way possible, exactly what their general had promised, and to whom. On the 21st of November, as dawn broke over the snow-covered peaks, the enemy launched their final assault. Thousands of soldiers poured down the mountainsides like an avalanche of steel and gunpowder. The Moravian regiment, reduced to fewer than 400 effective fighters, formed a desperate defensive line around a ruined monastery that had become their final stronghold. Eisenhart stood at the center of the line, his massive figure unmistakable even in the chaos of battle. He wielded an ancient sword that seemed to drink in the morning light, leaving a trail of shadow in its wake as he cut down enemy after enemy. For 3 hours, the fighting raged with an intensity that defied human endurance. Then came the shot. That should have ended everything. A sniper, positioned in the bell tower of the monastery ruins, had been tracking the general's movements. At exactly 11 minutes past 10 in the morning, he fired a single bullet from his long rifle. The projectile, a heavy lead ball moving at tremendous velocity, struck von Eisenhart directly in the chest, punching through his uniform, through his ribcage, and directly through his heart. The impact lifted the general off his feet and sent him crashing backward into the snow. Blood, impossibly bright against the white ground, began pooling beneath his motionless form. His men watched in horror as their commander lay still, his grey eyes staring sightlessly at the grey November sky. For exactly 13 seconds, General von Eisenhart was dead. Then he sat up. Blood was still streaming from the wound in his chest, soaking his uniform and leaving a crimson trail in the snow behind him. But he stood, slowly and deliberately, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the battlefield with unnatural clarity. "I made a promise," he said, and every man within 100 yards could hear him as if he was speaking directly into their ears. And promises to the darkness are not broken by something as trivial as death. What happened next was witnessed by over 600 men from both sides of the battle, and their testimonies, recorded years later by military historians and church investigators, all tell the same impossible story. The general continued to fight, with a hole in his chest large enough to put a fist through. With no heartbeat and no pulse, von Eisenhart picked up his sword and resumed command of his forces. He moved with the same precision and tactical brilliance that had made him legendary. But now there was something else in his movements. Something that made veteran soldiers weep with terror, even as they followed his orders. He cast no shadow. His breath produced no steam in the freezing air. When he walked, his boots left prints in the snow, but the prints filled with a dark substance that wasn't quite blood and wasn't quite dirt. The battle turned. Enemy soldiers, confronted with the sight of a dead man who refused to acknowledge his death, began to break ranks and flee. But von Eisenhart wasn't content to simply repel the attack. He began organizing the impossible, a fighting retreat that would take his men through 60 miles of enemy-controlled territory in the dead of winter, with virtually no supplies. "Every man goes home," he repeated throughout that first day, his voice never changing in tone or volume despite the gaping wound in his chest. "Every man goes home alive." The retreat began at sunset on the 21st of November. 378 men, following a dead general through mountain passes that should have been impassable, toward safety that lay 3 days, marched through territory controlled by enemy forces that outnumbered them 10 to 1. For 72 hours, General von Eisenhart led his men through the most harrowing journey in military history. They moved only at night, navigating by starlight through treacherous mountain paths, where a single misstep meant a fatal fall into bottomless ravines. During the day, they sheltered in caves and abandoned buildings, while the general stood watch, his grey eyes scanning the horizon for threats that his living men could not perceive. The enemy pursued them relentlessly. Cavalry units, mountain infantry, local militias, all converged on the retreating Moravians like wolves, following the scent of blood. But somehow, impossibly, von Eisenhart always seemed to know where the threats would come. He would position his men in defensive positions before enemy scouts were even visible. Order changes in direction minutes before enemy patrols would have discovered their trail. On the second night, Private Müller, one of the youngest soldiers in the regiment, approached the general during a brief rest stop in an abandoned village church. He later wrote in his memoirs that he wanted to tend to the wound in his commander's chest, to at least attempt to stop the bleeding that had continued unabated for over 30 hours. But when he got close enough to see the wound clearly, what he discovered drove him to the edge of madness. There was no bleeding, because there was no blood left in the general's body. The hole in his chest was perfectly round, perfectly clean, and through it, Müller could see the cracked stone floor of the church on the other side. Von Eisenhardt's heart was simply gone, destroyed completely by the sniper's bullet. Yet he continued to move, to speak, to command with the same authority he had possessed in life. When Müller asked his general how this was possible, von Eisenhardt turned his grey eyes on the young soldier and spoke words that Müller would never forget. There are contracts written in languages older than human speech. Boy. Agreements made with entities that exist in the spaces between seconds, in the pause between heartbeats. I signed such a contract long ago, in blood that was not entirely my own. Death is just another enemy to be outmaneuvered. On the third day, the most horrific test of the general's impossible promise came when they encountered an enemy ambush that should have destroyed them completely. 500 soldiers, hidden in the rocky outcroppings of a narrow canyon, opened fire on the retreating Moravians from 3 sides simultaneously. 17 men fell in the first volley. 17 men who had survived the siege, who had followed their dead general through 2 days of nightmare, cut down in an instant by precision rifle fire. For the first and only time during the retreat, von Eisenhardt screamed. It was not a human sound. It was something that seemed to come from the earth itself, a howl of rage and anguish that shattered ice formations on the canyon walls and sent enemy horses into panic that threw their riders and fled into the wilderness. And then the general did something that broke every natural law. He brought them back. Walking among the 17 fallen soldiers, von Eisenhardt knelt beside each one and whispered words in a language that predated human civilization. One by one, the dead men opened their eyes and sat up. Their wounds sealing themselves, their broken bones mending with audible cracks and pops. But they were not quite alive. Like their general, they cast no shadows and made no breath steam. In the freezing air, their eyes held the same grey, distant quality as von Eisenhardt's, and when they spoke, their voices carried the same unnatural clarity that could be heard clearly across impossible distances. The ambush was not just repelled, it was annihilated. The enemy soldiers, confronted with the sight of dead men rising at the command of their undead general, broke completely. Some fled screaming into the wilderness and were never seen again. Others threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. From forces they could not comprehend, von Eisenhardt showed no mercy. For the first time in the retreat, his tactical decisions were driven not by the goal of getting his men home safely, but by something darker and more vengeful. The enemy force was wiped out to the last man. Their bodies left scattered across the canyon floor like broken dolls, as the sun set on the third day. The lights of the border fortress of Grenzwald became visible in the distance. Safety home. The end of an impossible journey through a landscape that had become a waking nightmare. 378 men had begun the retreat 3 days earlier. 378 men approached the gates of Grenzwald as the church bells rang midnight, marking the end of the 24th of November. Every man who had served under General von Eisenhardt's command was returning home alive, exactly as he had promised, as the gates opened and the survivors stumbled into the warmth and light of the fortress. Von Eisenhardt stood at the rear of the column, ensuring that every last soldier passed safely inside the walls. Only when the final man had crossed the threshold did the general take his own step toward the gate, and the moment his boot touched the stone of the entranceway, General Caspar von Eisenhardt finally allowed himself to die. His massive frame crumpled to the ground like a marionette with severed strings. The grey light faded from his eyes, and for the first time in 72 hours, the terrible wound in his chest stopped its impossible non-bleeding. The ancient sword fell from fingers that had maintained their grip on its handle, even in death. And where it struck the stone, it shattered into fragments that dissolved like smoke. The 17 men he had raised from death during the canyon ambush collapsed simultaneously, their borrowed life returning to whatever dark source had provided it. But unlike their general, they fell with peaceful expressions on their faces, finally granted the rest that death should have given them. The official military records list the cause of General von Eisenhardt's death as complications from battle, wounds sustained in action. The reports make no mention of the 72 hours he spent leading a retreat with a hole where his heart should be. They don't describe how 17 dead soldiers walked and fought alongside their living comrades for an entire day. They certainly don't record the testimony of over 300 witnesses who swore that their general had made some sort of supernatural bargain to ensure their safe return. But the truth has a way of surviving, even when official histories try to bury it. In the military cemetery at Grenzwald, there stands a monument unlike any other in Europe. It's a simple stone obelisk, unmarked except for a single line carved in a language that scholars have never been able to translate. Local legend says that the inscription reads, "A promise kept," but no one knows for certain. What is certain is that fresh flowers appear at the base of the monument every November 21st, placed there by unknown hands. The flowers are always black roses, a variety that doesn't grow naturally in that region and can't be cultivated in the harsh mountain climate. And every year, on the anniversary of the retreat, travelers through the Carpathian Passes report seeing a tall figure walking the mountain trails, always alone, always moving toward the east, where the old battlefields lie forgotten under decades of snow and silence. The survivors of the 7th Moravian Regiment never spoke publicly about what they witnessed during those 3 days in November 1823. But in their private letters and journals, discovered years after their deaths, they all wrote variations of the same disturbing truth. Some promises are so sacred, so binding, that not even death can break them. And when a man makes such a promise, two forces that exist beyond human understanding, the price of keeping it may be far more terrible than the cost of breaking it. General Caspar von Eisenhardt kept his word. Every man under his command returned home alive. But the question that haunts the few who know the true story is this: what did the general promise in return? And to what ancient, hungry darkness did he offer his soul as collateral? In the deepest archives of the Vatican, there exists a file marked with symbols that predate Christian iconography by millennia. Inside that file is a single document, written in von Eisenhardt's own hand, describing the ceremony he performed on his 18th birthday, alone in the catacombs beneath his family's ancestral castle, a ceremony that bound his life and death to the service of his men, regardless of the cost to his eternal soul. The document ends with a single line that Vatican scholars have spent decades trying to understand. When the last soldier is safe, when the final promise is kept, only then may the undying one know peace. But peace, for some, is a luxury that must be earned through an eternity of service. General von Eisenhardt made his promise and kept it, no matter the cost. But perhaps the most terrifying truth of all is this: somewhere in the frozen wilderness of the Carpathian Mountains, his watch continues still, because a promise made to darkness is not fulfilled by a single act of impossible heroism. It's a debt that echoes through eternity, paid in service that knows no end.